Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The hard problem of consciousness. Why brain activity does not explain experience. A neuroscientist maps every neuron in the visual cortex, traces every connection, measures every firing pattern, understands completely the physical processes that occur when someone sees the color red, knows which wavelengths of light activate which photoreceptors, which signals travel along which pathways, which brain regions respond, and the scientist can predict with perfect accuracy when someone will report seeing red, can manipulate brain states to produce the experience, has complete knowledge of the physical mechanisms. And yet philosopher David Chalmers asks a question that this knowledge does not answer. Why is there something it is like to see red? Why does the physical processing produce a subjective experience, a quale, a feeling of redness that exists from the inside, from the first-person perspective? And this question is the hard problem of consciousness, the problem of explaining why and how physical processes give rise to subjective experience, to phenomenal consciousness, to the felt quality of mental states. And Chalmers distinguishes this from the easy problems, which are merely difficult scientific questions about how the brain processes information, how it integrates data, how it produces behavior. And while these easy problems are challenging, they are tractable, are problems science can solve through normal methods. But the hard problem is different, is a question of a different kind. Asks not how consciousness functions, but why it exists at all. Why there is subjective experience accompanying physical processes rather than those processes occurring without any inner experience, without anything it is like to undergo them. Imagine a zombie, a philosophical zombie, a creature that is physically identical to a human being, molecule for molecule, neuron for neuron, that behaves exactly like a human, says the same things, acts the same ways, but has no inner experience, no consciousness, is dark inside. And Chalmers argues that such a zombie is conceivable, is logically possible. And if zombies are possible, then consciousness is not reducible to physical processes, because the zombie has all the physical processes but lacks consciousness. And so consciousness must be something additional, something over and above the physical. And this is why the hard problem is hard, because it seems to require explaining how something non-physical, something subjective, emerges from something physical, something objective. And no amount of knowledge about brain function, about neural mechanisms, about information processing, seems to bridge this gap, seems to explain why there is something it is like rather than nothing. Visualize the explanatory gap. On one side is all the physical information, all the facts about brain states and neural firing and chemical processes. And on the other side is subjective experience, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the taste of coffee. And the gap between these two sides seems unbridgeable. Seems like knowledge of one does not give knowledge of the other. And no matter how much we learn about brains, we do not seem to get closer to explaining why brains produce consciousness, why certain physical systems have inner lives. And this gap is what makes the hard problem hard, what makes consciousness seem mysterious, what makes it resist scientific explanation. The hard problem has generated multiple responses. Materialists who deny that there is a hard problem, who argue that consciousness is reducible to physical processes, that once we fully understand the brain, we will understand consciousness, that the appearance of a gap is due to our current ignorance, and dualists who accept the hard problem and argue that consciousness is non-physical, is a separate substance or property that exists alongside the physical, and Mysterians who accept the hard problem but argue that it is unsolvable, that human cognitive capacities are limited, that we may never understand how consciousness arises from physical processes because our minds are not equipped to grasp the answer. One materialist response appeals to functionalism, argues that consciousness is not a separate thing, but is identical to certain functional roles, certain patterns of information processing, and what it is like to see red is just the functional role that seeing red plays in the cognitive system, the way it affects memory and behavior and other mental states. And this functional role can be fully captured physically, can be explained in terms of brain processes, and so there is no explanatory gap, no hard problem, only a conceptual confusion that disappears once we realize that consciousness is function and function is physical. Another materialist response appeals to eliminativism, argues that our ordinary concepts of consciousness are confused, are based on folk psychology that science will replace. And when neuroscience matures, we will abandon talk of subjective experience, we'll recognize that what we called consciousness was really just neural processes misdescribed, and the hard problem will dissolve, because the phenomenon it concerns, subjective experience as we currently conceive it, does not exist, and this radical response rejects the starting point of the hard problem, rejects that there is anything subjective that needs explaining. Dualist responses accept that consciousness is irreducibly subjective, is not reducible to physical processes, and argue for property dualism, where consciousness is a non-physical property that physical systems can have, or substance dualism, where consciousness is a separate mental substance that interacts with the physical body. And these views face the interaction problem, the question of how non-physical consciousness can affect physical processes, how mental causation works, and dualists have proposed various answers, some appealing to fundamental psychophysical laws, others denying that consciousness has causal power, but none has achieved consensus. Mysterian responses associated with Colin McGinn accept that the hard problem is real, but argue that it is unsolvable by humans, that our cognitive architecture is not suited to understanding how consciousness arises from matter. Just as rats cannot understand quantum mechanics, humans cannot understand consciousness. And this is not a failure of science, but a limit of human cognition. And we should accept this limit, recognize that some questions are beyond us, and the hard problem is one of them. The hard problem also connects to the knowledge argument. To Mary, the colour scientist who knows all physical facts about colour but has never seen colour, and when she finally sees red for the first time, she learns something new, learns what red looks like, and this suggests that physical knowledge does not exhaust knowledge about consciousness, that there are facts about subjective experience that are not physical facts, and this supports the view that consciousness is not reducible to physical processes, that the hard problem is real. The neuroscientist continues mapping neurons, continues discovering mechanisms, and the scientific progress is real, is impressive, reveals extraordinary complexity in how brains process information. But the hard problem remains, the question of why this processing feels like anything, why there is an inner light, why we are not zombies, and Chalmers's challenge persists, unsolved, perhaps unsolvable, a permanent limit on scientific explanation, or perhaps a confusion that will dissolve with better understanding. And philosophers and scientists continue to debate, continue to propose theories, continue to argue about whether consciousness is physical or non-physical, reducible or irreducible, explicable or mysterious, and the hard problem endures as one of the central problems in philosophy of mind, a problem that touches on the nature of reality, on the relationship between mind and matter, on what we are and what it means to be conscious. And the problem remains hard, stubbornly resistant to solution, a gap that knowledge does not seem to close, an explanatory challenge that persists despite centuries of reflection and decades of neuroscience, and consciousness continues to feel mysterious, continues to seem like something that physics cannot capture, and the hard problem stands as a monument to this mystery, a permanent reminder that subjective experience, the felt quality of mental life, resists reduction to objective physical processes. And whether this resistance reflects a genuine metaphysical divide or merely our current conceptual limitations remains one of philosophy's deepest and most difficult questions. The information paradox. What happens to information? When it falls into a black hole forms when a massive star collapses. Its gravity becomes so intense that nothing can escape, not even light, and the boundary beyond which escape is impossible is called the event horizon, a spherical surface surrounding the black hole, and anything that crosses this horizon is lost forever, pulled inexorably toward the central singularity where density becomes infinite and the known laws of physics break down. And this seems straightforward. Black holes consume matter and energy. They grow as they absorb material, and information about what fell in is destroyed, erased from the universe. But this simple picture creates a profound paradox, because quantum mechanics insists that information cannot be destroyed, that the universe preserves a complete record of its state, that if you know the present perfectly, you can, in principle, reconstruct the past. And this principle of information conservation is fundamental to quantum theory, underlies the mathematics of quantum mechanics. And if information can be destroyed in black holes, then quantum mechanics is wrong, or incomplete, or requires modification. And this clash between black hole physics and quantum mechanics is the information paradox, first articulated clearly by Stephen Hawking in the 1970s and still not fully resolved despite decades of intense research. Imagine throwing a book into a black hole. The book contains information, words on pages encoding knowledge, and as the book falls toward the event horizon, it crosses that boundary and disappears. And an observer watching from outside can never retrieve the book, can never read its contents. The information seems lost, and if millions of books are thrown in, if stars and planets and entire galaxies are consumed, all that information vanishes and the black hole carries no record of what it ate. It is characterized completely by just three numbers: its mass, its electric charge, and its angular momentum, and everything else. All the details, all the structure, all the information about what fell in is gone. And this erasure of information violates quantum mechanics, violates unitarity, the principle that time evolution is reversible, that information is conserved, and so we face a dilemma: either quantum mechanics fails, or general relativity fails, or our understanding of black holes is incomplete. And all three options are troubling. All three challenge the foundations of modern physics. The paradox deepens when Hawking radiation is considered, because Hawking discovered in 1974 that black holes are not completely black. They emit thermal radiation. Due to quantum effects, near the event horizon, virtual particle pairs pop into existence just outside the horizon. One particle falls in and the other escapes, and this process causes the black hole to slowly evaporate, to lose mass over time, radiating energy into space, and eventually, after an immensely long time, the black hole evaporates completely, disappearing in a final burst of radiation. And the question arises: what happens to the information that fell in? Does it emerge in the Hawking radiation, encoded somehow in the particles that escape, or is it destroyed when the black hole evaporates? And Hawking initially argued that information is lost, that the radiation is purely thermal, completely random, carrying no information about what fell in. And this conclusion shocked the physics community, contradicted quantum mechanics, and triggered a debate that has lasted decades. Visualize the black hole evaporating, slowly shrinking as it radiates, and the radiation escaping as a stream of particles, photons, and other quanta. And these particles are hot, thermal, their properties determined by the black hole's temperature, and temperature is statistical, depends only on energy, not on the details of what produced the radiation. And so the Hawking radiation seems to carry no information about the book that fell in, about the stars that were consumed, about the specific configuration of matter that formed the black hole. And if the radiation carries no information, then when the black hole evaporates completely, when the last bit of mass is radiated away and the black hole vanishes, the information is gone, erased from the universe, and quantum mechanics is violated. And this is Hawking's original conclusion: information is lost. And this creates the paradox. Many physicists rejected this conclusion, argued that information must somehow be preserved, that the radiation must carry subtle correlations, quantum entanglements that encode the information in ways that are not obvious, that appear thermal locally but contain hidden structure globally. And this view, that information is preserved, requires that the Hawking radiation is not purely thermal but contains incredibly subtle quantum correlations that encode everything that fell in. And these correlations would be fantastically complex, impossible to detect in practice, but they must exist to preserve unitarity, to maintain consistency with quantum mechanics. And this led to proposals about how information might escape, perhaps through quantum corrections to Hawking's calculation, perhaps through the interior structure of black holes being more complex than classical general relativity suggests, perhaps through the holographic principle, which says that all information in a region of space can be encoded on its boundary. And so information that falls into a black hole is actually stored on the event horizon, not lost inside, and gradually released as the black hole evaporates. The debate between information loss and information preservation became one of the most important controversies in theoretical physics, with Hawking on one side arguing for loss and most of the quantum mechanics community on the other arguing for preservation, and the stakes were high. If information is lost, then quantum mechanics needs revision. If information is preserved, then general relativity or our understanding of black hole interiors needs revision, and either way, fundamental physics faces a crisis. And the paradox drove research in string theory, quantum gravity, holography, and black hole thermodynamics. And gradually, a consensus emerged that information is probably preserved, that Hawking radiation is not purely thermal, but carries information in subtle quantum correlations, though the details of how this works remain contentious and incomplete. Hawking eventually conceded the argument, famously changed his mind in 2004, and admitted that information is probably preserved, though he did not provide a complete mechanism, and the information paradox remains partially resolved. The community believes information is preserved, but lacks a complete detailed understanding of how information encoded in matter that falls into a black hole is transferred to the Hawking radiation that comes out. And this question touches on the deepest issues in quantum gravity, on the unification of general relativity and quantum mechanics, on the nature of space-time at the Planck scale, and on the limits of what can be known about the interior of black holes. And the paradox endures as a driving force in theoretical physics, a puzzle that has inspired new ideas, new mathematics, new ways of thinking about space and time and information. The book falls across the horizon, its pages fluttering, its words disappearing, and the black hole absorbs it, grows slightly more massive, and eventually the black hole evaporates. Hawking radiation streaming out, particles escaping, and somewhere in that radiation, encoded in correlations too subtle to detect, the information about the book survives, preserved by the laws of quantum mechanics, hidden but not destroyed. And the paradox resolves, not by destroying information, but by recognizing that black holes are more subtle than they seem, that the event horizon is not a simple boundary, but a complex quantum surface, that the interior is not a simple void, but a region where space-time and quantum mechanics intertwine in ways we are only beginning to understand. And the information paradox remains, solved in principle, but not in detail, a monument to the challenge of reconciling quantum mechanics and gravity, and a reminder that black holes, mysterious and powerful, continue to teach us about the fundamental nature of reality, about the limits of our theories, and about the deep connections between information, entropy, and the structure of space-time. The knowledge argument, what the colour scientist learns when she leaves her room. A scientist named Mary spends her entire life in a black and white room, a room devoid of colour, where everything is shades of grey, and Mary is a brilliant neuroscientist who specialises in colour vision, and she studies colour from this colourless room using black and white monitors and books. And she learns everything physical there is to know about colour, learns about wavelengths and photoreceptors and neural pathways, learns about opponent processing and colour constancy, knows exactly which brain states correspond to which colour experiences, can predict with perfect accuracy what someone will report when shown a coloured object. And Mary's knowledge of the physical facts about colour is complete, exhaustive, includes every fact that physics, chemistry, and neuroscience can provide. And yet Mary has never seen colour, has never experienced red or blue or yellow. And then one day, Mary leaves the room, steps outside, and sees a ripe tomato for the first time. And she experiences red. And philosopher Frank Jackson asks, does Mary learn something new? Does she gain new knowledge when she sees red for the first time? And the intuition is yes. She learns what red looks like, learns what it is like to experience red. And this new knowledge is not physical knowledge, because she already had all physical knowledge. And so there are facts about consciousness, facts about subjective experience that are not physical facts. And physicalism is false. And this is the knowledge argument, also called the Mary argument, one of the most influential arguments against physicalism, a challenge to the view that the physical facts exhaust all facts. Imagine Mary's situation, surrounded by books and papers explaining colour in physical terms. She knows that red light has wavelengths around 700 nanometers, knows that it activates long wavelength cones in the retina, knows the neural pathways from retina to visual cortex, knows which patterns of neural firing correspond to red experiences, and she can answer any questioner about the physics and neuroscience of colour, can predict how people will react to colours, what they will say, how their brains will respond. And yet when she sees red for the first time, she says, aha, so that is what red looks like. And this reaction suggests she learned something, gained knowledge she did not have before. And since she already knew all physical facts, the new knowledge must be non-physical, must be knowledge of phenomenal facts, of what experiences are like. And these phenomenal facts are not reducible to physical facts, are additional to them. And so physicalism is incomplete, fails to capture everything about consciousness. The knowledge argument can be formulated as follows. Mary knows all physical facts about colour vision before leaving the room. When Mary leaves the room and sees red, she learns something new. Therefore, there are facts about colour vision that are not physical facts. And this conclusion supports property dualism, supports the view that conscious experiences have phenomenal properties that are not physical properties, that the subjective character of experience is something over and above the objective physical facts. And the argument challenges physicalist theories of mind, challenges the claim that neuroscience can give complete knowledge of consciousness, suggests that first-person subjective experience involves aspects that third-person objective science cannot capture. Visualize the two kinds of knowledge. On one side is Mary's complete physical knowledge, all the objective facts about colour, the facts that can be stated in scientific language, measured by instruments, predicted by theories. And on the other side is phenomenal knowledge, knowledge of what red looks like, knowledge that can only be acquired through experience, through having the experience oneself. And the knowledge argument says these two kinds of knowledge are distinct, that no amount of the first kind can yield the second kind, and this distinctness shows that phenomenal facts are not physical facts, that consciousness has properties that resist physical reduction. Physicalists have developed multiple responses to the knowledge argument. The ability hypothesis argues that what Mary gains when she leaves the room is not new factual knowledge, but new abilities. the ability to recognize red, to imagine red, to remember red. And abilities are not facts, are know-how rather than know that. And so Mary's gain does not show that there are non-physical facts, only that physical knowledge does not automatically confer all abilities. And this response distinguishes knowing facts from having abilities, treats phenomenal knowledge as a kind of skill rather than propositional knowledge. The acquaintance hypothesis argues similarly that Mary gains acquaintance with red, becomes directly related to the experience of red in a way she was not before. But this acquaintance is not knowledge of new facts, it is a new way of knowing old facts, a new mode of presentation of facts she already knew. And so the knowledge argument fails because what Mary gains is not new knowledge, but new acquaintance. An acquaintance with experiences is compatible with physicalism does not show that there are non-physical facts. The old fact new guy's response argues that Mary learns no new fact but learns an old fact in a new way, learns about the physical property of experiencing red by having that experience, whereas before she only knew about it through descriptions and theories. And the same fact, the physical fact about red experiences, can be grasped in different ways, through theoretical knowledge or through direct experience, and Mary's situation involves gaining a new mode of access to old facts, not gaining access to new facts, and so the argument does not refute physicalism. Another response denies the key intuition, argues that Mary does not learn anything new when she leaves the room, that she already knew what red looks like from her complete physical knowledge. That complete physical knowledge includes phenomenal knowledge, and our intuition to the contrary is mistaken, is based on underestimating what complete physical knowledge would include. And if Mary truly knew everything physical about colour, then she would be able to deduce what red looks like, would already have phenomenal knowledge. And so the argument's premise is false. The knowledge argument also raises questions about the relationship between different kinds of knowledge, between theoretical and experiential knowledge, between objective and subjective perspectives, and whether these can be integrated, whether science can accommodate first-person phenomenal facts. And Jackson himself later rejected the knowledge argument, became a physicalist, argued that the knowledge Mary gains is not knowledge of new facts but is compatible with physicalism, though other philosophers continue to defend the argument, continue to insist that Mary's gain shows the incompleteness of physical accounts of consciousness. Mary sits in her black and white room, learning about colour, mastering every physical fact, and then she steps outside, and the world bursts into colour, and she sees red for the first time, and the tomato glows in the sunlight, and her reaction is wonder, is discovery, is the sense of learning something utterly new, and whether this reaction reveals that physicalism is false, that consciousness includes non-physical properties, or whether it merely shows that knowledge comes in different forms, different modes, remains disputed, remains one of the central debates in philosophy of mind, and the knowledge argument persists, powerful and controversial, a challenge to physicalist theories, a defense of the irreducibility of phenomenal consciousness, and a reminder that subjective experience, the what-it-is likeness of mental states, resists capture in purely objective physical terms, and Mary's story continues to be told, to be analysed, to be debated, and the question remains, did she learn something new, something that physical knowledge could not provide? And the answer determines whether consciousness can be fully explained by neuroscience, or whether phenomenal experience involves something more, something that transcends the physical. And the knowledge argument endures as a vivid illustration of the explanatory gap, the gap between physical facts and phenomenal facts, between brain and mind, between what we can know objectively and what we can only know by experience. The lottery paradox. Imagine a fair lottery with 1 million tickets, and exactly one ticket will win, and you have not yet learned which ticket won. And now consider each individual ticket. Ticket number 1 has a 1 in a million chance of winning. which means it has a 999,999 in a million chance of losing. And this is overwhelmingly probable, so probable that it seems rational to believe that ticket 1 will not win. And the same reasoning applies to ticket 2, ticket 3, and every other ticket. Each has a minuscule chance of winning and an enormous chance of losing, and so it seems rational to believe of each ticket that it will not win. But now a problem emerges. If you believe that ticket 1 will not win, and you believe that ticket 2 will not win, and you believe this for each of the million tickets, then it seems you should believe that no ticket will win, because belief is generally thought to be closed under conjunction. If you believe P and you believe Q, then you should believe P and Q. And by repeated application of this principle, if you believe of each ticket that it will not win, then you should believe that none of them will win. But you also know with certainty that exactly one ticket will win. This is a stipulated fact of the lottery, and so you believe both that no ticket will win and that some ticket will win. And these beliefs are contradictory, and so you hold contradictory beliefs, which seems paradigmatically irrational. Yet each individual belief, the belief that ticket 1 will not win, the belief that ticket 2 will not win, and so on, seems perfectly rational, justified by the overwhelming probability. And so the lottery paradox forces a choice between accepting that rational belief can be inconsistent, rejecting closure of belief under conjunction, or denying that high probability is sufficient for rational belief. The paradox was articulated by Henry Kaiberg in the 1960s, and it has generated an enormous literature in epistemology with various proposed solutions and no clear consensus. And the paradox reveals deep tensions in our ordinary thinking about belief, knowledge, probability, and rationality. Tensions that cannot be easily resolved without giving up some cherished principles or intuitions. One response is to reject closure, to argue that rational belief is not closed under conjunction, that you can rationally believe each of many propositions without rationally believing all of them together, especially when the propositions are probabilistic and the number of them is large. And this response aligns with the observation that the probability of a conjunction is the product of the probabilities of the conjuncts. And so even if each ticket has only a 1 in a million chance of winning, the probability that at least one ticket wins is certainty. And so there is a gap between the high probability of each individual proposition and the low probability of their conjunction. And this gap justifies believing each individual proposition while not believing their conjunction. Another response is to raise the threshold for rational belief, to argue that high probability is not sufficient for belief, that belief requires something stronger, perhaps near certainty or probability, above some higher threshold, like 99% or 99.9%. And if we raise the threshold high enough, then it will no longer be rational to believe of each ticket that it will not win, because the probability that it will not win, while high, is not high enough to meet the raised threshold. And so the paradox dissolves, because the initial premise that it is rational to believe of each ticket that it will not win is rejected. A third response distinguishes between degrees of belief or credence and full belief, arguing that we should assign high credence to the proposition that ticket 1 will not win, perhaps 99.9999%, but we should not fully believe it. And full belief is reserved for propositions that meet a higher standard, perhaps certainty or near certainty. And this response preserves the intuition that high probability matters for rationality, while avoiding the paradox by denying that high probability justifies full belief. Still another response embraces a kind of rational inconsistency, arguing that in certain situations it is rational to hold inconsistent beliefs, that consistency is not an absolute requirement of rationality, that the world is complex and uncertain, and our beliefs must reflect that uncertainty, even if it means tolerating some inconsistency. And this response aligns with the preface paradox, where an author rationally believes each claim in a book while rationally believing that not. All the claims are true, and both paradoxes suggest that closure of belief under conjunction is too strong a requirement, that it demands a kind of logical perfection that finite agents in uncertain environments cannot achieve. The lottery paradox also connects to debates about the nature of knowledge, because it seems clear that you do not know that ticket 1 will not win, even though you have excellent evidence for believing it. And this suggests that knowledge requires something more than justified true belief, perhaps a safety condition, the requirement that in nearby possible worlds where you believe PP is true, and in the lottery case there are nearby worlds where the lottery is run fairly and ticket 1 wins, in which your belief that ticket 1 will not win is false, and so your belief fails the safety condition and does not constitute knowledge, even if it happens to be true. The paradox has practical implications as well, because we constantly make decisions based on beliefs that have high but not maximal probability. We believe that the plane will not crash, that the medicine will work, that the bridge will not collapse, and in each case there is a small probability that our belief is false. Yet we act on these beliefs. We board the plane, take the medicine, cross the bridge, and if we refuse to believe or act on anything less than certainty, we would be paralyzed, unable to function in a world of uncertainty. And so, the lottery paradox is not merely an abstract puzzle, but a reflection of the epistemic situation we constantly face, the need to navigate between skepticism and credulity, between demanding too much certainty and accepting too little, between the logical ideal of perfect consistency and the practical necessity of acting on incomplete information. The million tickets sit in the urn, one will win, the others will lose, and reason seems to say both that we should believe of each that it will lose, and that we should not believe that all will lose. And this contradiction, or apparent contradiction, has no easy resolution, no solution that preserves all intuitions and principles. And so the paradox remains a permanent challenge to theories of rational belief, a puzzle that forces philosophers to clarify what they mean by belief, by rationality, by justification, and to acknowledge that our ordinary concepts, when pressed to their limits, reveal inconsistencies and tensions that may be ineliminable features of finite cognition rather than problems to be solved. And the lottery continues, the tickets are drawn, one wins, the others lose, and we believe what we must believe, what rationality seems to demand, even when those beliefs, taken together, lead to contradiction. And the paradox endures, a monument to the gap between logical perfection and epistemic reality, between what we ought to believe in principle and what we must believe in practice. The non-identity problem, why creating a disabled child, seems wrong but harms no one. A woman takes medication that she knows will cause her future child to be born with a disability that will significantly reduce the child's quality of life, but will not make life so bad that it is not worth living, and the child will live with chronic pain, with limited mobility, with challenges that most people do not face. But the child will still experience joy and love and meaning, and life will be worth living overall, just harder, just less good than it could have been. And we are inclined to say that the woman did something wrong, that she should have stopped taking the medication, should have waited until it cleared her system before conceiving. And if she had waited, she would have conceived a different child, a healthy child. And this seems like the obviously right choice, but now philosopher Derek Parfit poses a troubling question. Who exactly was harmed by the woman's choice? Who was made worse off? And the answer is puzzling, because the disabled child cannot claim to have been harmed. Because if the woman had waited and conceived a different child, then this particular child would not exist at all, and the disabled child's only alternative to existing with a disability is not existing. And existing with a disability, as long as life is worth living, is better than not existing. And so the disabled child is not worse off, is actually better off for existing. And if no one was harmed, then how can the action be wrong? And this is the non-identity problem, a puzzle about how to ground judgments of wrongness in cases where the identity of affected individuals depends on the choices being evaluated. Imagine the scenario more carefully. At time 1, the woman is taking medication, and she has a choice: conceive now and have a disabled child, or wait a month, stop the medication, and conceive a healthy child. And suppose she chooses to conceive now, and 9 months later, a child is born with a disability. Call this child Alex, and Alex grows up facing challenges, but also experiencing good things. And on balance, Alex is glad to be alive, prefers existing to not existing. And now we ask whether the woman wronged Alex, whether Alex was harmed by the woman's choice. And the problem is that the alternative was not Alex without the disability. The alternative was a different child entirely, because different sperm and egg would have united if the woman had waited, and different genetic material produces a different person. And so Alex's options were either exist with the disability or not exist at all. And Alex is better off existing with the disability than not existing. And so how can Alex complain? How can Alex say the woman wronged them, when the only other possibility is non-existence? And if Alex cannot complain, then who can? And if no one can complain, then in what sense was the action wrong? The problem generalizes beyond this specific case. It arises whenever a choice affects who will exist rather than merely affecting how existing people will fare. And these cases are called non-identity cases, and they include decisions about environmental policy, where current generations choose between policies that affect which future people will exist. Decisions about genetic engineering, where parents choose traits for children who would not exist without that choice. Decisions about timing of reproduction, where different times lead to different children. And in all these cases, the people affected by the choice cannot claim they would have been better off if a different choice had been made, because they would not have existed if a different choice had been made. And so, standard harm-based reasoning seems to fail, seems unable to explain why these choices might be wrong. Visualize the problem as a branching tree. At the decision point, 2 branches extend. On one branch, a child with disability exists. On the other branch, a different healthy child exists. And we compare the 2 branches and say the second is better, produces a better outcome, a healthier child, less suffering, more well-being. But when we try to say who benefits from choosing the second branch, we cannot point to anyone. The disabled child does not benefit, because that child does not exist in the second branch. The healthy child does not benefit, because that child does not exist in the first branch. And so, there is no person who is made better off by choosing the better branch. And this seems to undermine the claim that the better outcome is better for anyone. And yet we strongly feel that the choice matters, that creating a child with avoidable disability is wrong. Parfit proposed the non-identity problem as a challenge to person-affecting principles. Principles that say an action is wrong only if it makes someone worse off. And these principles work well for ordinary cases where the same people exist regardless of the choice, but they fail for non-identity cases where different choices lead to different people existing. And if we want to maintain that choices in non-identity cases can be wrong, we must adopt impersonal principles, principles that evaluate outcomes based on total or average well-being, or some other measure that does not depend on comparing how well-off particular individuals are across different choices. But impersonal principles face their own difficulties. They can imply things like the repugnant conclusion. They can recommend creating vast populations with minimal welfare, and they can conflict with intuitions about person-relative reasons and obligations. One response to the non-identity problem is to reject the claim that wrongness requires harming someone, to argue that some actions are wrong, even though they do not make anyone worse off, and creating a child with an avoidable disability is wrong. Not because it harms the child, but because it fails to give the child the best start in life, violates a duty to create the best children we can, and this response requires specifying what duties we have regarding procreation, what standards of care apply to potential children, and whether these duties are owed to specific individuals or are impersonal obligations about making the world better. Another response is to argue that the disabled child is harmed after all, harmed relative to an appropriate baseline, and the baseline is not non-existence, but rather the life the child could have had if different choices had been made, even though those choices would have resulted in a different child. We can still say that creating a child with avoidable disability is wrong because it brings into existence someone whose life contains avoidable suffering. And this suffering is bad even if it does not make anyone worse off compared to any alternative where that same person exists. And this response requires defending an impersonal notion of harm. Harm that is not comparative, not based on counterfactuals about specific individuals, but based on the presence of bad states like suffering. A third response is to bite the bullet and accept that the action is not wrong, that if no one is harmed, then nothing bad has happened. And this response embraces person-affecting principles and accepts their implications even in non-identity cases, admits that we cannot say the woman wronged the disabled child, cannot say she should have waited, and while this seems counterintuitive, perhaps our intuitions are wrong, perhaps we are confused about non-identity cases, and the theoretical clarity of person-affecting principles outweighs the cost of accepting counterintuitive conclusions. The non-identity problem has practical implications for reproductive ethics, for decisions about genetic screening, prenatal testing, selective abortion, and genetic modification, because many of these decisions are non-identity cases where choosing one option means one child exists, and choosing another means a different child exists. And if we cannot say these choices harm anyone, then it becomes difficult to regulate them. Difficult to say parents have obligations about which children to create. And yet most people feel strongly that some procreative choices are wrong, that parents should not knowingly create children with serious avoidable disabilities, that we have reasons to prefer healthy children, and these feelings need grounding, need principles that explain why these choices matter, even though no particular person is made worse off. The woman stands at the choice point, medication in hand, and she can conceive now or wait, can create a child with disability or create a different healthy child, and the choice seems obvious. And yet when we try to justify the obvious answer, try to explain why waiting is better, the justification becomes elusive, slips through our fingers, because no one is harmed by conceiving now. The child who exists is glad to exist, and the child who would exist if she waited does not exist to be disappointed. And the non-identity problem reveals a gap in our moral thinking, a case where our judgments are clear, but our reasons are unclear, where standard moral frameworks fail to explain intuitions we hold strongly, and Parfit's problem remains unsolved, challenging, forcing recognition that identity matters, that who exists matters, and that moral philosophy has not yet developed adequate tools for handling cases where choices determine who exists rather than merely how well existing people fare, and the problem persists, technical and troubling, a reminder that even procreation, the most basic of human activities, raises profound ethical puzzles that resist easy answers. The origination paradox, why you cannot create yourself. A philosopher asks where free will comes from. What makes a choice truly free, truly yours? And the answer seems to require that you be the ultimate source of your choices, that your decisions originate with you rather than being caused by factors beyond your control. And this origination, this ultimate sourcehood, seems necessary for responsibility, because if your choices are caused by factors you did not create, by genes you did not choose, by environments you did not design, by prior causes that reach back before your birth, then how are you responsible for those choices? How are they truly yours? And yet origination seems impossible, seems to require that you create yourself, that you choose your own character before you have a character to make choices with. And this is the origination paradox, the problem that free will seems to require ultimate origination, ultimate sourcehood, being the first cause of your actions, but such origination is impossible, requires creating yourself from nothing, requires existing before you exist to make the choices that create you. And this impossibility suggests that free will, understood as requiring ultimate origination, is impossible, is an incoherent concept, and responsibility is problematic. And this paradox has driven many philosophers to conclude that free will, in the strong libertarian sense, does not exist, cannot exist, and the most we can have is a weaker compatibilist freedom that does not require ultimate origination. Imagine trying to be the ultimate source of your actions, trying to take complete responsibility for what you do, and you trace back the causes of your action. Your action was caused by your decision. Your decision was caused by your desires and beliefs. Your desires and beliefs were caused by your experiences and your innate psychology. Your innate psychology was caused by your genes and early development. Your genes were caused by your parents, and the causal chain extends back before your existence. And at no point in this chain did you create the causes. At no point did you originate the factors that shaped you. And so you are not the ultimate source of your actions. You are a link in a causal chain that extends beyond you. And if responsibility requires ultimate origination, then you are not responsible because you did not originate yourself, did not create the character from which your choices flow. The origination paradox can be stated as an impossibility argument. To be ultimately responsible for an action, you must be ultimately responsible for how you are, for your character, your values, your psychology, because your action flows from how you are, and to be ultimately responsible for how you are. You must have chosen to be that way, but to choose to be a certain way, you must already have some character, some values, some psychology to make the choice with. And this prior character must itself have been chosen if you are to be ultimately responsible for it. And this leads to an infinite regress. You must have chosen your character. Before choosing your character, must have existed before you existed to create yourself. And this is impossible. And so ultimate responsibility, ultimate origination is impossible. And if free will requires it, then free will is impossible. Visualize the regress to be responsible for action. A, you must be responsible for character C that caused A, and to be responsible for C, you must be responsible for earlier character CE that caused C, and to be responsible for C, you must be responsible for even earlier character C, and so on infinitely. And the regress cannot be completed, cannot be grounded, because there is no first character that you chose, no original act of self-creation. And so the chain of responsibility has no beginning, hangs unsupported, and ultimate responsibility collapses. And with it collapses free will understood as requiring ultimate origination. This argument, developed by Galen Strawson and others, is meant to show that libertarian free will understood as requiring ultimate sourcehood, is impossible, is incoherent. And this drives the debate toward compatibilism, toward the view that free will does not require ultimate origination, but only requires that actions flow from the agent's own psychology, from their desires and values, even if those desires and values were themselves caused by factors beyond the agent's control. And compatibilism avoids the origination paradox by weakening the requirements for freedom, by denying that ultimate origination is necessary. One response to the origination paradox accepts it, accepts that ultimate responsibility is impossible, and embraces the conclusion that no one is truly responsible in the ultimate sense. And this view, sometimes called hard incompatibilism, denies both that we have libertarian free will and that compatibilist freedom is sufficient for genuine responsibility. And moral responsibility is an illusion, is a concept that cannot be sustained once we recognize the impossibility of ultimate origination, and we should replace responsibility with other concepts, with forward-looking considerations about consequences and prevention rather than backward-looking considerations about desert and blame. Another response argues that ultimate origination is not necessary for responsibility, that responsibility requires only proximate origination, being the proximate cause of action, the immediate source. And as long as your action flows from your own deliberation, your own character, you are responsible, even if your character was shaped by prior causes, even if you are not the ultimate source. And proximate origination is sufficient for the kind of responsibility that matters for ethics and law. And the origination paradox shows only that ultimate responsibility is impossible, not that ordinary responsibility is impossible, and we should not let the impossible standard of ultimate origination undermine the possible standard of proximate origination. A third response from agent causation theories argues that persons are uncaused causes, are agents who can initiate causal chains without being caused to initiate them. And agent causation is a special kind of causation, different from event causation, where events cause events and agents, as substances have the power to cause events without being caused to exercise that power. And this avoids the regress because the agent does not need to cause themselves, does not need prior character to act, but can act directly as an uncaused cause. And this preserves ultimate origination by making agents first causes. But critics argue that agent causation is mysterious, unexplained, involves a kind of causation that seems inconsistent with naturalism, seems like magic, and the theory creates more problems than it solves. The origination paradox also connects to debates about moral luck, about whether we can be responsible for factors beyond our control, because the paradox shows that if we trace back far enough, everything is beyond our control, everything is luck, is the product of factors we did not choose, and if we cannot be responsible for luck, then we cannot be responsible for anything. And this conclusion, while following from the paradox, seems too extreme, seems to eliminate responsibility entirely, and this drives some philosophers to accept moral luck, to accept that we can be responsible for actions that depend on factors beyond our control. That responsibility does not require eliminating luck, but only requires certain kinds of control, certain kinds of connection between agent and action. The philosopher asks where you came from, how you became the person you are, and the answer traces back through causes, through genes and upbringing and choices and experiences, and none of these origins were ultimately under your control. None were self-created, and so you are not self-caused, are not self-created, are not the ultimate origination of yourself. And if responsibility requires self-creation, then you are not responsible, and the origination paradox stands as a permanent challenge to libertarian theories of free will, shows that ultimate origination is impossible, shows that we cannot be the uncaused first causes of ourselves, and whether this impossibility undermines all responsibility or only ultimate responsibility remains contested, and the paradox persists, a challenge to the idea that we are truly the authors of our actions, truly the originators of our choices, and the causal chain extends back, and you stand in the middle, caused by the past, causing the future, and where you came from. Who created you? The answer is no one. You emerged from causes, were shaped by forces, and the origination was not yours, was nature's, was the universe's, and whether this makes you unfree, makes responsibility impossible, remains one of the deepest questions in philosophy of free will, and the origination paradox endures, impossible to solve, impossible to escape, a permanent reminder that self-creation is impossible, and ultimate origination is a fantasy, and what we are left with is proximate origination, being the immediate cause of actions, being the link through which causes flow, and whether this is enough for freedom remains the central question, and the paradox stands stark and unavoidable, showing that we did not create ourselves, cannot create ourselves, and yet must live and choose and be responsible somehow. The paradox of democracy, when majority rule destroys itself. A democratic society values freedom and equality, gives every citizen voice, allows majority rule to determine policy, and this seems just, seems fair, seems like the best system for governance. And yet democracy contains internal tensions, contains paradoxes that threaten its stability, and one fundamental paradox asks, what democracy should do when the majority votes to end democracy? When the people use democratic procedures to elect authoritarian leaders who promise to dismantle democratic institutions? And if democracy respects majority, will it must allow this outcome, must permit its own destruction? But if democracy forbids this outcome, prevents the majority from choosing authoritarianism, then it violates its own principles, acts undemocratically. And this is the paradox of democracy, the recognition that democracy's commitment to majority rule can lead to outcomes that destroy democracy itself. And navigating this paradox requires balancing competing values, requires defending democracy sometimes against democratic procedures, requires recognizing that procedural democracy is not sufficient, that substantive commitments to rights and freedoms are necessary to preserve democracy. And this paradox has been central to political philosophy since ancient times, was recognized by Plato, who argued that democracy tends toward tyranny, and the paradox remains relevant today as democratic societies face authoritarian movements that use democratic means to gain power. Imagine an election where an authoritarian party campaigns on promises to restrict freedoms, to eliminate checks and balances, to concentrate power, to end future elections, and this party wins a majority, wins through legitimate democratic procedures, through free and fair voting, and now the society faces a choice. Honour the election results and allow democracy to be dismantled, or override the results and preserve democracy by undemocratic means. And neither option is satisfactory. Both involve betraying core democratic values. And the paradox emerges from the fact that democracy values both procedural fairness and substantive freedoms. And these can conflict. Majority will can threaten minority rights, can threaten the institutions that make democracy possible. And when conflict occurs, democracy faces an impossible choice. Preserve procedure or preserve substance, respect majority, will or defend fundamental freedoms. The paradox connects to Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance, the recognition that unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance, that tolerant societies must be intolerant of intolerance to survive. And the same structure applies to democracy. Unlimited democracy, democracy that respects all majority decisions regardless of content, leads to the disappearance of democracy. And democratic societies must be undemocratic toward anti-democratic movements to preserve democracy, and this creates the paradox. Democracy must violate its principles to preserve its principles, must act undemocratically to remain democratic. And this tension is permanent, is inherent in the structure of democracy, cannot be fully resolved, but must be managed through careful balancing of competing considerations. Visualize democracy as having two aspects: procedural democracy, which emphasizes voting, majority rule, fair elections, and substantive democracy, which emphasizes rights, freedoms, protections for minorities, and ideally these aspects reinforce each other. Procedures protect rights and rights enable procedures, but they can conflict. Procedures can be used to undermine rights, majorities can vote to restrict freedoms, and when conflict occurs, the society must choose which aspect to prioritize, and different societies make different choices. Constitutional democracies emphasize substantive protections, have constitutions that limit majority power, protect fundamental rights even against majority will. And these systems accept that democracy involves more than majority rule, involves commitments to principles that cannot be overridden by votes. And this resolves the paradox partially, makes democracy less purely procedural, more substantively constrained. One response to the paradox argues that true democracy is substantive, not procedural, that democracy is not just about voting, but about respecting rights, protecting minorities, ensuring freedom. And when these substantive commitments are threatened, even by majority vote, democracy requires defending them, requires overriding the majority. And this militant democracy, this democracy that defends itself against anti-democratic forces, is not a betrayal of democracy, but is its preservation, is necessary to maintain the conditions that make democracy possible. And historical examples support this. Societies that failed to restrict anti-democratic movements, that allowed authoritarians to use democratic procedures to gain power, lost their democracies, and hindsight suggests that early intervention, that militant defense would have been justified, would have preserved democracy even though it involved undemocratic means. Another response distinguishes between procedural rules and constitutional principles, argues that democracies should have entrenched principles that cannot be changed by ordinary procedures, that require supermajorities or constitutional amendments, and these entrenched principles include fundamental rights, democratic structures, and protections for minorities. And ordinary majorities can make policy within these constraints, but cannot override the principles themselves. And this response preserves both procedural and substantive democracy, allows majority rule within limits. And the paradox is resolved by recognizing that democracy is hierarchical, has constitutional principles at one level and democratic procedures at another, and procedures operate within the framework set by principles, and this framework is not itself subject to ordinary democratic revision. A third response embraces the paradox, accepts that democracy is inherently unstable, inherently vulnerable to self-destruction, and argues that this vulnerability is a price worth paying for freedom, that the alternative, restricting democracy to protect democracy, is worse than the risk of democratic collapse. And this radical democratic response trusts in the people, trusts that majorities will not choose their own oppression, and when they do, the society pays the price. And this response is rare. Most societies are unwilling to risk democratic collapse, prefer to impose constraints on democracy, but the response represents one coherent position, one way of resolving the paradox by accepting its consequences. The paradox also appears in debates about hate speech, about whether democracies should allow speech that advocates for the destruction of democracy, speech that promotes authoritarianism or discrimination. And free speech is a democratic value, is protected in democratic societies. But speech that aims to destroy democracy creates the paradox, and banning such speech seems undemocratic, seems to violate free expression, but allowing it risks democracy's survival. And different democracies resolve this differently. Some ban anti-democratic speech, some allow it, and no resolution is without costs. All involve trade-offs between competing values. The election results are counted, the authoritarian party has won, and the democratic society faces the paradox: honour the results and risk losing democracy, or override the results and betray democratic procedures. And the choice is not theoretical, is faced by real societies, has been faced throughout history, and different societies have chosen differently. Some have preserved democracy by undemocratic means, some have respected procedures and lost democracy, and the paradox remains unresolved, remains a permanent tension in democratic governance, a challenge that every democracy must navigate, must balance procedure against substance, must defend itself without betraying itself. And the paradox of democracy endures as a fundamental problem in political philosophy, a recognition that democracy contains contradictions, that majority rule can lead to minority oppression, that freedom can be voted away, and that preserving democracy sometimes requires limiting democracy, and the tension persists. The balance is delicate, and the paradox remains unsolved, a permanent feature of democratic life. The paradox of power. Why having power makes you lose it. A leader gains power through competence, through understanding others' needs, through empathy and social intelligence, through building coalitions and reading situations accurately. And these qualities enable the rise to power, enable winning support, enable navigating social hierarchies, and the leader reaches positions of authority, gains control over resources, gains ability to make decisions affecting others. And then something changes. The experience of having power alters the psychology of the powerful, reduces empathy, reduces perspective taking, increases confidence, increases risk taking. And these changes are the opposite of what brought power, are the erosion of the very qualities that enabled gaining power. And this is the paradox of power, described by psychologist Dacher Keltner and others. The finding that power changes people, makes them less attuned to others, less socially intelligent, less effective at the behaviours that won them power. And powerful people become entitled, become overconfident, become less accurate in reading social situations. And these changes lead to misuse of power, lead to decisions that harm subordinates, lead to loss of support, and eventually lead to loss of power itself. And the paradox shows that power contains the seeds of its own destruction, that having power undermines the qualities necessary to maintain power. And this cycle explains the rise and fall of leaders, explains why initial competence gives way to corruption or incompetence, explains why power corrupts. And the paradox has implications for understanding leadership, for recognizing that power is dangerous, that maintaining power requires deliberate effort to preserve the qualities that win power, requires resistance to the psychological effects of having power. Imagine the psychological changes that occur when someone gains power, gains control, gains authority, and research shows that power activates the behavioral approach system, increases focus on rewards, increases willingness to take risks, and simultaneously, power deactivates the behavioral inhibition system, reduces attention to threats, reduces concern about others' reactions, and these changes make powerful people more action-oriented, more decisive, but also less careful, less considerate. And experiments demonstrate this, show that people primed to feel powerful are more likely to interrupt others, to speak out of turn, to violate social norms, to take what they want without considering others, and powerful people literally see less, attend less to others' emotions, are worse at identifying facial expressions, are less accurate in reading social cues. And this reduced social intelligence is ironic because social intelligence is what typically wins power, is what enables navigating social hierarchies, and power reduces the very capacity that was necessary to gain it. The paradox of power demonstrates that power is self-undermining, that the experience of having power changes people in ways that make them worse at wielding power, that the psychological effects of power include overconfidence, reduced empathy, increased risk-taking, reduced constraint, and these effects lead to mistakes, lead to alienating subordinates, lead to poor decisions, and eventually lead to loss of power. And the cycle repeats. New leaders rise through empathy and social intelligence, gain power, lose these qualities, make mistakes, lose power. And the paradox is that the qualities needed to gain power are different from or opposite to the psychological effects of having power. And this mismatch drives the cycle, drives the rise and fall of leaders. And preventing the cycle requires awareness, requires powerful people to recognize the psychological effects of power and deliberately compensate, deliberately maintain empathy, deliberately attend to others, deliberately resist the natural effects of power. Visualize the paradox as a feedback loop. Gaining power reduces empathy. Reduced empathy leads to poor decisions. Poor decisions alienate supporters. Alienated supporters withdraw support. Withdrawn support leads to loss of power, and the loop is negative, is self-reinforcing, is a cycle that drives powerful people toward downfall. And breaking the loop requires intervention, requires powerful people to resist the psychological effects of power, requires institutional checks that constrain power, requires cultures that maintain accountability, And without such mechanisms, the loop runs its course, power leads to its own destruction, and the paradox unfolds. One mechanism underlying the paradox is the disinhibition effect, the finding that power reduces inhibition, reduces self-regulation, reduces the internal constraints that normally prevent people from acting on impulses, and powerful people feel freer to do what they want. Feel less constrained by social norms, feel less concerned about consequences, and this freedom can be positive, can enable decisive action, can overcome excessive caution, but it also leads to inappropriate behavior, leads to violations of norms, leads to taking advantage of others, and the disinhibition effect explains many abuses of power, explains why powerful people harass subordinates, why they take liberties, why they feel entitled, and the effect is not intentional malice, but is psychological change caused by having power, is reduced inhibition that allows latent tendencies to manifest. Another mechanism is the decreased perspective taking, the finding that power reduces the ability and motivation to understand others' perspectives, to imagine how situations look from others' viewpoints, and powerful people focus on their own goals, their own needs, and pay less attention to others. And this reduced perspective taking makes powerful people worse at negotiation, worse at building consensus, worse at understanding how their actions affect others, and these deficits undermine effectiveness, undermine leadership, and create the conditions for losing power. And the paradox is complete. Power reduces the social intelligence needed to maintain power. One response to the paradox is institutional design, creating checks on power, creating accountability mechanisms, creating regular reviews or elections that force powerful people to maintain support. And democratic systems embody this, have regular elections that remove leaders who lose support, and corporate boards have review processes. And these institutions mitigate the paradox by making power conditional, by requiring continued demonstration of competence, by preventing the complacency that power breeds. And effective institutions recognize the paradox, recognize that power corrupts, and design around it, create structures that limit the damage caused by the psychological effects of power. Another response is leadership development, training leaders to recognize the paradox, to understand the psychological effects of power, to deliberately maintain empathy and perspective-taking. And research shows that awareness helps, that leaders who understand the paradox are better at resisting its effects, are more likely to maintain the qualities that won them power. And leadership training increasingly includes content about the psychology of power, about the importance of humility, about the need to deliberately attend to others despite the psychological pull towards self-focus. And this training aims to break the cycle, aims to help powerful people resist the natural effects of power. A third response is cultural, creating organizational cultures that value empathy, that reward perspective-taking, that punish abuse of power. And some organizations succeed at this, create environments where power does not corrupt, where leaders remain accountable, remain connected to subordinates. And these cultures require work, require deliberate effort to maintain, require norms that constrain power, that make abuse costly, and they require exemplars, require leaders who model healthy use of power, who demonstrate that power can be wielded without corruption. And these cultural interventions show that the paradox is not inevitable, is not deterministic, but can be managed through collective effort. The paradox also connects to ancient wisdom, to the recognition across cultures and eras that power corrupts, that absolute power corrupts absolutely, that leaders must guard against the temptations of power. And philosophers from Plato to Confucius recognized the paradox, recognized that power changes people, and their advice remains relevant, remains a warning that power is dangerous, that vigilance is necessary, that humility is essential, and the paradox of power shows that this ancient wisdom is psychologically accurate, is confirmed by modern research, is not merely moral preaching, but is description of how power actually affects people. The leader rises, gains authority, controls resources, makes decisions, and power begins its work, reduces empathy, increases overconfidence, loosens inhibitions, and the leader becomes less effective, less attuned, more self-focused, makes mistakes, alienates supporters, and the fall begins, and the paradox completes its arc. Power undermines itself. The qualities that won power are lost, and new leaders rise to repeat the cycle, and the paradox of power endures as a permanent feature of leadership, as a psychological reality that must be managed, that must be resisted, that must be constrained through institutions and culture and awareness. And the paradox remains inevitable and destructive unless deliberately countered, unless powerful people recognize the effects and fight them, unless societies build structures that limit the damage and the cycle continues. The rise and fall driven by the paradox that having power undermines the ability to keep it. The paradox of tolerance, when being open-minded means destroying open-mindedness. A liberal society values tolerance, values the freedom to believe different things, to practice different religions, to hold different political views, to live in different ways. And this tolerance is seen as a virtue, as essential to freedom and democracy, as the foundation of peaceful coexistence in diverse societies. And the principle seems clear. We should tolerate all views and practices, should allow maximum freedom, should not suppress beliefs or ways of life just because we disagree with them. And yet a problem emerges, a paradox first articulated clearly by philosopher Karl Popper in 1945, which asks what a tolerant society should do when faced with intolerance, when confronted by movements that reject tolerance itself, that seek to destroy the open society and replace it with authoritarianism, that demand the right to spread hate and silence opposition. And if the tolerant society tolerates these intolerant movements, if it grants them freedom to organize and spread their views, then the intolerant movements will eventually gain power and destroy tolerance itself, will shut down free speech, will persecute minorities, will end democracy, and the tolerant society will have tolerated itself out of existence. And this is the paradox of tolerance, the recognition that unlimited tolerance leads to the destruction of tolerance, that to preserve a tolerant society, it may be necessary to be intolerant toward intolerance, to refuse to tolerate those who would destroy tolerance. Imagine a democracy where free speech is protected, where all political views are allowed, where movements can organize and campaign and attempt to win power through elections. And now, imagine a fascist movement that explicitly rejects democracy, that promises to seize power and end elections and establish dictatorship. And this movement uses the freedoms of the democratic system to grow, uses free speech to spread propaganda, uses freedom of assembly to recruit followers, uses democratic procedures to gain seats in parliament, and at each stage, the democratic society faces a choice. Do we tolerate this movement? Do we allow it to continue operating within the system, even though its goal is to destroy the system? Or do we suppress it? Do we ban the movement, arrest its leaders, prevent it from spreading its message? And if we suppress it, are we betraying our own principles? Are we becoming intolerant ourselves? And if we do not suppress it, are we complicit in our own destruction? Are we naive? Are we allowing democracy to commit suicide? Popper's answer was that we should not tolerate the intolerant, that tolerance is not a suicide pact, that a society that wishes to remain tolerant must be willing to defend itself against movements that seek to destroy tolerance, and this means that tolerance has limits, that it does not extend to those who would abuse it to eliminate tolerance. And Popper acknowledged that this is paradoxical, that the tolerant society must practice intolerance, must suppress certain views, must limit freedom in order to preserve freedom. But he argued that this is necessary, that the alternative is the death of tolerance, and history supports this. Societies that tolerated fascist movements in the 1920s and 1930s saw those movements seize power and establish brutal dictatorships. And the lesson is that tolerance must be defended, that it cannot be absolute, that there are views and movements that cannot be accommodated within a free society because their goal is to end freedom. But this creates difficult questions about where to draw the line, about which views count as intolerably intolerant, about who decides, about what methods of suppression are legitimate. Because if we ban every movement that seems threatening, if we suppress every view that makes us uncomfortable, then we are no longer a tolerant society. We have become the oppressors. We have done the work of the intolerant for them. And so the paradox is not fully resolved by saying we should not tolerate intolerance, because we need principles to determine what counts as intolerance. What level of threat justifies suppression, and whether suppression means banning speech, banning organizations, arresting people, or merely refusing to engage, refusing to give platforms, refusing to treat intolerant views as legitimate options in public debate. Visualize a spectrum of intolerance. On one end are views that are merely offensive or unpopular, views that challenge prevailing norms, views that make some people uncomfortable. And these views, even if we find them objectionable, should be tolerated in a free society, should be allowed to be expressed and debated, because tolerance means accepting that people will hold views we dislike. And suppressing offensive views is censorship, is the tyranny of the majority, is the opposite of the tolerance we claim to value. And on the other end of the spectrum are movements that actively seek to destroy democratic institutions, that incite violence, that organize to strip rights from minorities, that threaten the basic conditions of a free society. And these movements, Popper argues, need not be tolerated, can be suppressed to protect the tolerant society. But the middle of the spectrum is murky, filled with cases where reasonable people disagree about whether a movement or view crosses the line. And this is where the paradox bites hardest, where we must make judgments without clear rules, where any decision risks either tolerating too much and allowing intolerance to grow, or suppressing too much and becoming intolerant ourselves. Some philosophers argue that the paradox can be resolved through procedural rules, through formal commitments to democratic processes. A tolerant society tolerates all views that accept the democratic framework, that agree to compete peacefully for power, that accept the results of elections and respect the rights of others. But it does not tolerate movements that reject these procedures, that seek power through violence or intimidation, that refuse to accept electoral defeat. And this procedural approach provides a clear line. Tolerance extends to those who play by the rules, not to those who seek to overturn the rules. But critics note that even this approach involves substantive value judgments, because the democratic framework itself embodies values like equality and freedom. And so we are saying we tolerate all views except those that reject our core values. And this is not neutral tolerance, but partisan tolerance, tolerance of a specific range of views that we have already deemed acceptable. Others argue that the solution involves distinguishing between tolerating views and tolerating actions, that a truly tolerant society allows people to hold and express any beliefs, but does not allow them to act on beliefs that harm others. So expressing racist views might be tolerated, but discriminatory actions are not. Advocating for dictatorship might be tolerated, but attempting a coup is not. And this distinction seems to preserve free thought and speech while preventing harm, but it faces difficulties because speech can cause harm, hate speech can incite violence, propaganda can radicalize people, and drawing the line between harmless expression and harmful action is not straightforward. And some argue that by the time intolerant movements act, it may be too late, that tolerant societies must suppress intolerant speech before it metastasizes into intolerant action. The paradox also has a psychological dimension, because tolerating intolerance is emotionally difficult, requires accepting that people will spread views you find abhorrent, will organise against values you hold dear, will seek to undermine the society you want to preserve. And this acceptance is painful, creates tension, and there is a constant temptation to suppress, to silence, to refuse to tolerate, and distinguishing between legitimate suppression of genuine threats and illegitimate censorship of mere disagreement requires judgment, requires resisting the urge to label all opposing views as intolerable, requires humility about our own fallibility, and these are difficult virtues to maintain, especially in polarized times when every political disagreement feels existential. The tolerant society stands at the edge, welcoming diverse views, protecting freedom, and watching as intolerant movements test the boundaries, push the limits, demand the right to destroy the very system that protects them. And the society must decide, must draw a line, must say some things cannot be tolerated, some movements cannot be accommodated. And in drawing that line, the society becomes less than perfectly tolerant, accepts that tolerance has limits, that the open society must defend itself. And the paradox does not disappear, but is managed, lived with, navigated through judgment and vigilance. And Popper's warning echoes, unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance, and so tolerance must be limited, must exclude those who would destroy it. And this is not a betrayal of tolerance, but its preservation. Not a contradiction, but a recognition that all principles have boundaries, that values must be defended, and that the truly tolerant society is one that tolerates everything except intolerance. And the paradox remains, uncomfortable and unresolved, a permanent feature of liberal democracy, a reminder that freedom is fragile, that it must be actively maintained, and that tolerance for all its virtues is not enough by itself, must be supplemented with vigilance, with judgment, with the willingness to say no, to draw lines, to defend the open society against those who would close it. And the tension persists, always present, always requiring balance, and the paradox endures. The philosophical zombie argument, why consciousness might not come from physics. A creature walks among us that looks exactly like a human being, molecule for molecule identical, atom for atom the same, every neuron firing in the same patterns, every behavior perfectly matched. And this creature speaks as we speak, acts as we act, responds to pain by withdrawing, to beauty by smiling, to loss by crying. And yet inside there is nothing. No subjective experience, no consciousness, no inner light, no feeling of what it is like to be this creature. And this being is called a philosophical zombie, or P-zombie, a thought experiment in philosophy of mind that challenges physicalism, challenges the view that consciousness is nothing more than physical processes. And the zombie argument asks us to imagine such creatures, to consider whether they are conceivable. And if they are conceivable, then they are metaphysically possible. And if they are possible, then consciousness cannot be identical to physical processes, cannot be reduced to brain states, because the zombie has all the physical processes but lacks consciousness. And this shows that consciousness is something extra, something additional to the physical. And this is the philosophical zombie argument, deployed by David Chalmers and others to defend property dualism, to argue that subjective experience is not reducible to objective physical facts. And the argument remains one of the most debated arguments in contemporary philosophy of mind. Imagine encountering a zombie, engaging in conversation, watching it navigate the world, and nothing in its behavior betrays the absence of consciousness. It claims to be conscious, describes its experiences in first-person terms, acts exactly as a conscious being would act, and the only difference, the only divergence between zombie and human is the inner life, the presence or absence of subjective experience, and the zombie has none, is dark inside, operates purely through physical mechanisms without any accompanying phenomenology. And the argument asks whether such a being is conceivable, whether we can coherently imagine it. And if we can, then consciousness is not necessitated by physical structure, is not entailed by brain processes, and physicalism fails, and some form of dualism must be true. The argument can be stated formally as follows. It is conceivable that there be zombies, creatures physically identical to humans, but lacking consciousness. If zombies are conceivable, then they are metaphysically possible. If zombies are metaphysically possible, then consciousness is not identical to physical processes. Therefore, consciousness is not identical to physical processes. And this conclusion challenges materialism, challenges the view that everything is physical, that mental states are brain states, and forces recognition of an explanatory gap, a gap between physical facts and phenomenal facts that cannot be bridged by physical explanation alone. Visualize two worlds. One is our world, filled with conscious beings who have inner lives, who experience redness and pain and joy, and the other is zombie world, physically identical. Every particle in the same position, every force acting identically, but lacking consciousness. All beings are zombies, and the question is whether zombie world is possible, whether it is a coherent scenario, and Chalmers argues that it is, that we can conceive of such a world without contradiction, and this conceivability establishes possibility, and possibility refutes physicalism, shows that physical facts do not exhaust all facts, that there are phenomenal facts that are additional to physical facts. Physicalists respond to the zombie argument in multiple ways. The most direct response denies that zombies are conceivable, argues that the apparent conceivability is illusory, that we think we can imagine zombies because we are not thinking carefully enough, not considering all the implications, and that when we try to fill in the details, try to specify exactly how a zombie would work, contradictions emerge, and zombies turn out to be impossible after all. And this response requires showing that consciousness is entailed by physical structure, that given the right physical organization, consciousness must arise. And this is the hard part, explaining why and how physical processes necessitate consciousness. Another response accepts that zombies are conceivable, but denies that conceivability implies possibility, argues that there is a gap between what we can imagine and what is actually possible, that conceivability is an epistemic notion about what seems possible to us, while possibility is a metaphysical notion about what could actually be. And these can come apart. We can conceive of things that are actually impossible, like water being something other than H2O. And Kripke's work on necessity and identity supports this, shows that identities, like water is H2O, are necessary, even though we can conceive of their negation. And the same applies to consciousness, is brain process. It might be necessarily true, even though we can conceive of its negation. And so zombies, while conceivable, are not possible, and the zombie argument fails. A third response argues that the zombie argument begs the question, assumes what it sets out to prove, because the claim that zombies are conceivable assumes that consciousness is something separable from physical processes, something that could be absent while physical processes remain. And this assumption is precisely what physicalists deny. And so the argument does not refute physicalism, but merely asserts an alternative view. And physicalists are not obliged to accept the zombie scenario as genuinely conceivable, can reject it as incoherent or question-begging. The zombie argument connects to other arguments about consciousness, to the knowledge argument about Mary, and to the explanatory gap, and to the hard problem of consciousness, all pointing to the difficulty of explaining subjective experience in physical terms, all suggesting that phenomenal consciousness resists reduction. And these arguments collectively create a case for dualism, for the view that consciousness is not physical, though the case remains controversial, remains rejected by many philosophers who maintain that consciousness will eventually be explained physically, that the apparent gap is due to ignorance, not to genuine irreducibility. The zombie walks through the world, behaving normally, seeming conscious, And yet the question hangs, is there anyone home? Is there subjective experience? Or is the creature an automaton, a sophisticated mechanism that mimics consciousness without having it? And the zombie argument uses this thought experiment to probe the nature of consciousness, to test whether consciousness can be separated from physical structure. And the answer determines whether physicalism is true, whether everything about consciousness can be explained in physical terms, or whether consciousness is something more, something that transcends the physical. And the zombie remains, conceivable or not, possible or not, a thought experiment that continues to challenge materialist theories of mind, continues to force physicalists to explain how consciousness arises from matter, how subjective experience emerges from objective processes, and the philosophical zombie endures as one of the most vivid and controversial thought experiments in philosophy. A creature that may be impossible, but whose mere conceivability threatens physicalism, whose imagined existence reveals the explanatory gap between brain and mind, between matter and consciousness, and whether zombies could exist remains disputed, remains a test case for theories of consciousness, and the zombie argument persists as a central challenge to the view that science can explain everything, that physical facts exhaust all facts, and that consciousness is nothing more than brain processes arranged in certain ways. The prisoner's dilemma: why rational people choose worse outcomes. Two criminals are arrested, held in separate cells, cannot communicate, and the prosecutor offers each the same deal. Testify against your partner and you go free while your partner gets 10 years, or stay silent, and if your partner also stays silent, you both get 1 year for a lesser charge. But if you stay silent and your partner testifies, then you get 10 years and your partner goes free. And if you both testify, you both get 5 years. And each prisoner must decide independently, without knowing what the other will choose. And the rational analysis is straightforward. From each prisoner's perspective, testifying dominates staying silent. If your partner stays silent, you get freedom by testifying versus 1 year by staying silent. And if your partner testifies, you get 5 years by testifying versus 10 years by staying silent. So regardless of what your partner does, you're better off testifying. And since both prisoners reason this way, both testify, both get 5 years, and yet if both had stayed silent, both would have gotten only 1 year. And so rational individual decision-making produces a collectively worse outcome. And this is the prisoner's dilemma, one of the most important concepts in game theory, a demonstration that individual rationality can lead to collective irrationality, that pursuing self-interest can harm everyone, including yourself. And the dilemma has applications across economics, politics, environmental policy, international relations, and reveals fundamental tensions between individual and collective good, between rationality and cooperation. Imagine being one of the prisoners, sitting in the cell, considering your options, and you reason, if I stay silent, I get either 1 year if my partner stays silent, or 10 years if my partner testifies. And if I testify, I get either freedom if my partner stays silent, or 5 years if my partner testifies. And comparing these, testifying is better in both cases, gives me a better outcome regardless of what my partner does. And this is a dominant strategy, a strategy that is best no matter what others do. And rationality seems to require choosing your dominant strategy. And so you testify, and your partner reasons the same way, also testifies, and you both get 5 years. And looking back, you realize that if you had both stayed silent, you would both be better off, would both get only 1 year, but you had no way to ensure your partner would stay silent, no way to trust. And without trust, the rational choice is to testify, even though cooperation would benefit both. The prisoner's dilemma demonstrates the difference between Nash equilibrium, a state where no player can improve by changing strategy unilaterally, and Pareto optimality, a state where no one can be made better off without making someone worse off. And in the dilemma, both testifying is a Nash equilibrium because neither prisoner can improve by switching to silence if the other is testifying. But both testifying is not Pareto optimal because both could be better off if both stayed silent. And this divergence between equilibrium and optimality is what creates the dilemma, shows that rational individual decision-making can get stuck in suboptimal outcomes, can fail to reach mutually beneficial cooperation. Visualize the dilemma as a payoff matrix. Rows represent prisoner A's choices, columns represent prisoner B's choices, and the cells show the outcomes. And the structure reveals that mutual cooperation yields better outcomes than mutual defection. But cooperation is risky, is vulnerable to exploitation, and defection is safe. Is the rational choice if you cannot trust your partner. And the dilemma captures this tension between cooperation and defection, between trusting others and protecting yourself. And this tension is ubiquitous, appears in countless real-world situations, from arms races to environmental agreements to business competition. The prisoner's dilemma has multiple variants. Iterated prisoner's dilemma, where the same players interact repeatedly. An iteration changes the analysis because future interactions create incentives for cooperation, create opportunities for reputation building and retaliation, and strategies like tit for tat, where you cooperate initially and then mirror your partner's previous choice, perform well in iterated games, achieve cooperation through reciprocity. And this shows that repeated interaction can solve the dilemma, can enable cooperation even among self-interested rational agents. And real-world interactions are often repeated, are embedded in ongoing relationships, and this repetition facilitates cooperation, makes trust possible. Another variant is the multiplayer prisoner's dilemma, also called the tragedy of the commons, where many individuals face the choice between cooperating, restraining themselves for collective benefit, or defecting, pursuing individual benefit at collective cost. And examples include overfishing, pollution, climate change, where each individual's rational self-interest leads to collective disaster. And the tragedy of the commons shows that the prisoner's dilemma scales applies to large groups. And the problem is even harder with many players because coordination is more difficult, free riding is easier, and collective action problems arise, and solving these requires institutions, requires mechanisms for enforcement, for monitoring, for punishing defectors. And this is why societies have laws, have regulations, have enforcement mechanisms, because voluntary cooperation is difficult to sustain in large groups facing prisoners' dilemmas. The dilemma also has implications for moral philosophy, for understanding ethics and rationality, because the dilemma shows that rationality and morality can conflict, that the rational choice is to defect, to pursue self-interest, but the moral choice is to cooperate, to consider collective welfare. And this conflict challenges theories that equate rationality with morality, shows that purely self-interested rationality is insufficient for social welfare, requires supplementation with moral considerations, with concern for others, and various moral theories respond differently. Consequentialism might argue that the rational thing is to cooperate because outcomes matter. Contractarianism might argue that rational agents would agree to constraints on defection to avoid mutual harm. And virtue ethics might argue that cooperating reflects good character, even if not strictly rational, in narrow self-interest. One lesson from the prisoner's dilemma is the importance of institutions, of mechanisms that change incentives, that make cooperation rational, and laws that punish defection, contracts that bind parties, monitoring systems that detect cheating, all serve to solve prisoners' dilemmas. All transform situations where defection is rational into situations where cooperation is rational. And understanding the dilemma helps design better institutions, helps create systems where individual incentives align with collective good. And much of economics and political science concerns this problem, concerns how to structure institutions to promote cooperation in dilemma-like situations. Another lesson is the importance of communication, of trust building, of reputation, because in real-world dilemmas, Players can communicate, can make commitments, can observe each other's behaviour over time, and these factors facilitate cooperation, make it easier to coordinate on the cooperative outcome. And experiments show that allowing communication increases cooperation rates dramatically in prisoners' dilemmas. And this is why diplomacy matters, why negotiation matters, why building relationships matters, because these processes enable cooperation even when individual incentives favour defection. The prisoners sit in separate cells, cannot communicate, face the choice, and rational analysis drives them both to testify, to defect, even though cooperation would benefit both. And the dilemma reveals that rationality is not enough, that collective outcomes require more than individual optimization, require cooperation, trust, institutions, repeated interaction, communication, and the prisoner's dilemma remains one of the most important concepts in social science, a simple game that captures fundamental tensions in social life, that shows why cooperation is difficult, why self-interest can be self-defeating, why rational agents can fail to achieve optimal outcomes, and the dilemma persists as a permanent challenge to theories of rationality, to assumptions about markets and institutions, and as a tool for understanding why societies need laws, norms, enforcement, reputation, communication, all mechanisms that help solve dilemmas, that enable cooperation despite individual incentives to defect. And the prisoners testify, and both lose more than they needed to, and the dilemma endures. The problem of the one, why nothing can be truly unified. A philosopher asks the opposite question, not why there are many where we expect one, but why there is one where we observe many, asks how parts compose wholes, how multiplicity becomes unity, how many things can constitute one thing, and this is the problem of the one, the puzzle about unity, about what makes a collection of parts into a genuine single object rather than merely a plurality. And the problem is ancient, goes back to Greek philosophy, to debates about whether wholes are real or are merely conceptual constructions from parts. And the puzzle is that unity seems to require something beyond mere collection, requires a principle of unity that binds parts together. But what could this principle be? What makes a collection of atoms a person, rather than merely atoms arranged person-wise? What makes a ship rather than merely planks fastened together? And if unity is not explained by parts alone, then what explains it? And if unity is just conceptual, just imposed by our minds, then objects are not real, are not mind-independent, and reality consists only of parts, of fundamental particles, and all composition is conventional. And this threatens ordinary ontology, threatens the reality of familiar objects. And this is the problem of the one, the challenge to explain how genuine unity arises from multiplicity, how the one emerges from the many. Imagine a statue, a bronze sculpture of a human figure, and ask what the statue is, and one answer says the statue is a collection of bronze atoms arranged statue-wise. The atoms are parts and the statue is the whole. They compose. But what makes this collection a statue rather than merely atoms? What unifies the atoms into one object? And the answer cannot be just spatial proximity, because atoms separated by empty space are still separate, not unified. And the answer cannot be just causal interaction, because atoms in different objects interact causally, through electromagnetic forces, without composing a single object. And the answer seems to require something additional, a principle of unity, a form in Aristotelian terms, or a substance in Cartesian terms, something that binds parts into wholes. But this additional element is mysterious, is not itself a physical part, and positing it seems like mysterious ontology, and avoiding it seems to require denying that wholes exist, accepting mereological nihilism, the view that only simples exist, only fundamental particles, and composition never occurs, and all talk of composite objects is loose speaking, is convenient fiction. The problem of the one connects to debates about composition, about when parts compose wholes, about what conditions must be met for composition to occur, and the problem is that every proposed answer seems either too permissive, allows too many compositions, allows arbitrary collections to count as objects, or too restrictive, disallows too many compositions, eliminates familiar objects, and finding the right balance, the correct answer to when composition occurs, has proven impossible, and Peter van Inwagen argued that this impossibility suggests composition rarely occurs, perhaps only when parts constitute living organisms, and ordinary inanimate objects do not exist, are not genuine wholes, are only simples arranged object-wise. And this revisionary ontology preserves unity for organisms, but eliminates most ordinary objects. And critics find this too extreme, too counterintuitive, too willing to deny the obvious existence of chairs and tables and planets. Visualize unity as a relation between parts that binds them into wholes. And the question is, what grounds this relation? What makes it obtain? And if the relation is fundamental, not reducible to other facts about parts, then we have expanded our ontology, have added relations to our list of basic entities. And if the relation is reducible, is just parts having certain properties, or standing in certain spatial or causal relations, then we can eliminate talk of wholes, can replace it with talk of parts and their relations, and the whole is not an additional entity but is just the parts and relations described collectively. And this eliminativist approach solves the problem of the one by denying that unified wholes exist, accepting that only parts exist and unity is conceptual, is our way of organizing parts into groups. And objects are not discovered but constructed by our practices of grouping and naming. One response to the problem of the one embraces mereological universalism, argues that any parts whatsoever compose a whole, that composition always occurs, that for any collection of objects, no matter how disparate, there is a further object that they compose. And this position accepts vast ontology, accepts that there are objects, like the fusion of your left hand and the Eiffel Tower, bizarre, scattered objects that common sense would reject. And the advantage is that composition is simple, unrestricted, explained by a single principle. But the disadvantage is that most composite objects are not recognized by ordinary thought, are not natural kinds, are arbitrary fusions, and this threatens to make ontology too easy, too unconstrained, accepts too much rather than too little. Another response accepts that some compositions occur and others do not, that there are principal distinctions, that organisms compose wholes but arbitrary collections do not, that bonding or causation or functional integration grounds composition determines when parts unify into wholes, and this moderate position preserves ordinary objects, accepts that chairs and organisms exist while rejecting bizarre fusions. And the challenge is to state the principle precisely, to say exactly which compositions occur, and every proposed principle faces counterexamples, faces cases where intuition says composition occurs, but the principle says it does not, or vice versa, and no principle has won consensus, and the problem of the one persists as a challenge to find the correct theory of composition. A third response questions whether the problem has a solution, argues that composition is vague, is indeterminate, that there are cases where there is no fact of the matter whether composition occurs, where the boundary between unified whole and mere collection is fuzzy. And this response treats the problem of the one as showing that reality is indeterminate in certain respects, that not all questions about existence have determinate answers, and some philosophers embrace this, accept vague existence, while others reject it as incoherent, as violating the law of excluded middle, and the debate continues. The problem of the one also affects our understanding of ourselves, of persons, because persons seem to be unified wholes, seem to be single subjects of experience, despite being composed of many cells, many organs, many subsystems, and what unifies a person, what makes a collection of cells, one person rather than many cells. And the answer cannot be just physical contiguity, because persons survive cell replacement, survive gradual change in material composition, and the answer seems to require psychological continuity, sameness of consciousness, unity of perspective. But these are not physical properties, are not features of cells, and so persons might not be physical objects, might be non-physical entities that somehow relate to bodies, and this threatens materialism, threatens the view that persons are nothing over and above their physical parts. And the problem of the one for persons remains unsolved, remains a challenge for theories of personal identity. The statue stands, one or many, unified or merely assembled, and the person exists, one subject or many cells, and the problem of the one persists, asking how unity arises, how the many become one, how parts compose wholes, and no answer fully satisfies. No theory explains unity without mystery, without positing irreducible relations or denying obvious unities, and the problem endures as a central puzzle in metaphysics, a challenge to explain what we take for granted, that objects are singular, are unified, are more than mere heaps of parts, and perhaps unity is primitive, is inexplicable, is something we must accept without analysis. Or perhaps unity is illusory, is imposed by mind on parts that remain forever separate. And the problem remains, ancient and unresolved, a permanent fixture in ontology. The rubber hand illusion, when a fake hand becomes yours. A person sits at a table, their real hand hidden from view behind a screen, and a rubber hand, a realistic prosthetic, is placed in front of them where they can see it, and the experimenter uses two paintbrushes, simultaneously stroking the hidden real hand and the visible rubber hand in synchrony, the same strokes at the same times on corresponding locations, and after several minutes, something strange happens. The person begins to feel as though the rubber hand is their hand, feels the touch sensations as coming from the rubber hand rather than from the hidden real hand. And when the experimenter threatens the rubber hand, moves a hammer toward it, as if to strike, the person flinches, shows a physiological stress response, reacts as though the rubber hand is in danger. And this is the rubber hand illusion, discovered by Botvinnik and Cohen in 1998. A phenomenon demonstrating that body ownership, the sense that a body part is yours, is not fixed but is flexible, can be manipulated, can be extended to objects that are not part of your body, and the illusion reveals that the sense of body ownership is constructed by the brain through integration of visual, tactile, and proprioceptive information. And when these signals are consistent, when vision shows a hand being touched in the same way, and at the same time as tactile signals indicate your hand is being touched, the brain infers that the seen hand is your hand, updates the body representation, and the rubber hand is incorporated into the body schema. And the rubber hand illusion has profound implications for understanding embodiment, for understanding the sense of self, for prosthetic design, and for recognizing that the boundaries of the self are not fixed but are dynamic and constructed. Imagine the subjective experience. You watch the rubber hand, see the paintbrush stroke it, and simultaneously feel strokes on your real hidden hand. And at first the rubber hand is clearly not yours, is obviously a fake. But as the synchronous stroking continues, something shifts. The rubber hand begins to feel like it could be yours, begins to feel connected, and after several minutes, the feeling is strong. The rubber hand feels like part of your body, and when you're asked to close your eyes and point to where your real hand is, your pointing is shifted toward the rubber hand. You mislocalize your real hand, place it closer to the rubber hand than it actually is, and this proprioceptive drift shows that the body representation has been updated, has incorporated the rubber hand, and the illusion is not just a belief, but is a genuine perceptual shift, a change in how your body feels and where it feels located. The rubber hand illusion demonstrates multisensory integration, shows that the brain combines information from different senses to construct a coherent representation of the body. And when visual, tactile, and proprioceptive signals are consistent, they are attributed to the same body part, and the brain updates the body schema accordingly. And the rubber hand, despite being visibly fake, is integrated because the signals are consistent, vision and touch agree, and the brain prioritizes consistency over implausibility, treats the consistent signals as evidence of body ownership, and the illusion reveals that body ownership is not simply given by innate body knowledge, but is actively maintained through continuous multisensory integration. And the boundaries of the body are flexible, can be extended or contracted depending on sensory evidence. Visualize the body schema as a dynamic map, a neural representation of the body's configuration and boundaries. And this map is constantly updated based on sensory input, is adjusted to reflect current body state. And the rubber hand illusion shows that the map can be manipulated, can be made to include external objects, if the right sensory conditions are met. And this flexibility is adaptive, allows the body schema to incorporate tools and prosthetics, allows extension of the sense of embodiment beyond biological boundaries. And the illusion demonstrates this flexibility, shows that a rubber hand can be treated as real, can be incorporated into the body schema, can evoke proprioceptive shifts and emotional responses. The rubber hand illusion has practical applications for prosthetic design, for helping amputees incorporate artificial limbs, for creating prosthetics that feel like part of the body rather than like external tools, and understanding the conditions that produce the illusion, the need for synchronous multisensory stimulation, informs how prosthetics should provide feedback, how they should integrate visual and tactile signals. And the illusion has been used therapeutically, has been adapted to treat phantom limb pain, to help amputees resolve conflicts between visual evidence of absence and proprioceptive evidence of presence, and the techniques developed from studying the illusion have real clinical value. The illusion also has implications for understanding the self, for recognizing that the sense of body ownership is not a simple direct given, but is a constructed representation, is inferred from sensory evidence, and the self, at least the bodily self, is flexible, is not fixed by biological boundaries, and this challenges naive views of the self as a simple unity, as transparently given, and supports views that the self is constructed, is a model built by the brain, and the model can be manipulated, can include or exclude body parts depending on sensory evidence. And the rubber hand illusion shows this manipulation directly, shows that body ownership can be experimentally induced for fake limbs. And this raises questions about personal identity, about what makes a body part yours, about whether ownership is determined by biological connection or by sensory integration, and the illusion suggests the latter. One variant of the rubber hand illusion uses virtual reality, uses computer-generated hands that can be manipulated more precisely than rubber hands, can change appearance, can violate physical constraints, and virtual embodiment studies have shown that people can experience ownership of virtual bodies, can incorporate digital hands into their body schema. And this has applications for VR design, for creating immersive experiences, for understanding how to make virtual avatars feel like real bodies, and the principles discovered through the rubber hand illusion extend to virtual embodiment, show that the same multisensory integration mechanisms apply, and synchronous visuotactile stimulation produces ownership of virtual limbs just as it does for rubber limbs. Another variant explores whether the illusion extends beyond hands, whether legs or whole bodies can be incorporated, and studies have shown that full body illusions are possible, that people can experience ownership of entire mannequin bodies or virtual avatars when appropriate multisensory stimulation is provided. And these full body illusions demonstrate that body ownership is global, applies to the entire body representation, and can be manipulated systematically. And the flexibility of body ownership is even greater than the rubber hand illusion alone suggests. It extends to whole body reconfiguration. And this has implications for understanding disorders of body ownership, for understanding phantom limbs and body integrity identity disorder, and for developing therapeutic interventions. The rubber hand sits on the table, fake and obvious, and yet after synchronous stroking, it feels real, feels like part of the body, and the person flinches when it is threatened, responds emotionally and physiologically as though their real hand is in danger. And the illusion reveals that body ownership is constructed, is inferred from multisensory consistency, is flexible and dynamic, and the boundaries of the self are not fixed but are continuously updated based on sensory evidence. And the rubber hand illusion endures as one of the most striking demonstrations in cognitive neuroscience, a phenomenon that challenges assumptions about embodiment, that reveals the constructed nature of the bodily self, and that shows that even the most basic sense, the sense of which body parts are yours, is not simply given but is actively maintained through brain processes that can be fooled, can be manipulated, and the rubber hand becomes real, becomes incorporated, and the illusion persists.